The United States Navy ordered hundreds of these aircraft, but when the machine finally took to the sky, one thing became clear. The engineers had created not just another fighter, but a mechanical monster that even experienced pilots could barely control. Under its cowling was a 28-cylinder engine producing 3,600 horsepower. At full throttle, the pilot was pressed into his seat. The enormous propeller tried to throw the aircraft onto its left wing, and after every test flight, mechanics discovered new oil leaks and fresh signs of overheating. It seemed that the Super Corsair was only one step away from becoming the most dangerous piston-engine fighter of its era. But instead of combat squadrons, it faced a canceled order and almost complete oblivion. Why did the Navy abandon an aircraft in which enormous resources had already been invested? What did the test pilots discover? And is it true that the official explanation of the aircraft's purpose appeared much later in order to conceal the real reason behind the project's failure? Watch until the end. We will examine the documents, the test results, and one crucial detail that makes the story of the Super Corsair look completely different from the version repeated for decades. Many will ask, why call the idea reckless before the tests had even begun? Piston-engine aviation offers many examples of a new power plant transforming an aircraft that was already familiar to factories and pilots. Engineers could preserve a proven airframe, avoid stopping production, and still gain speed, altitude, and payload. On paper, the Corsair appeared ready for exactly that kind of transformation. And that argument is entirely fair. The Yak 9 family evolved through increasingly powerful engine variants, gaining greater speed and the ability to carry heavier armament. The story of the La 5 was even more dramatic. Fitting the powerful ASH-82 radial engine helped turn the troubled foundation of the Leji G3 into one of the most dangerous Soviet fighters of the war. Replacing an engine was not automatically an act of desperation. It was a proven engineering method. This concerns one of the central rules of wartime industry. When factories already know the airframe, pilots understand its behavior, and mechanics know how to service it, a deep modernization can be faster and cheaper than designing an entirely new aircraft. The Americans did not need to begin with a blank sheet. They already had a strong fuselage, the famous inverted gull wing, heavy armament, and a fighter being produced in large numbers. It seemed that only a few hundred additional horsepower were needed. The result could climb faster, leave a short carrier deck more aggressively, and escape danger with a sharper burst of acceleration. For the United States Marine Corps, that promise was especially attractive. On the island airfields of the Pacific, additional power was not a decorative figure in a report. It could mean taking off from a short runway with more fuel, more weapons, and a greater chance of returning after battle damage. But this was where the elegant theory began to break apart. The proposed engine was not a refined version of the existing power plant, and it did not fit neatly into the same dimensions. The Pratt and Whitney R4360 Wasp Major belonged to a completely different class of weight and mechanical complexity. It was a 28-cylinder, 4-row radial engine created not for simplicity, but for the pursuit of extreme power. This was no longer an ordinary modernization. It was an attempt to force the power plant of a much heavier aircraft into the body of a carrier fighter. Engineers would have to reconsider balance, cooling, engine mount strength, propeller diameter, and the aircraft's behavior when the throttle was opened suddenly. The situation was far from simple. To understand the scale of the problem, one figure is enough, although it will remain hidden for a moment. Just imagine the weight of that engine. Here was the figure that turned an elegant idea into an engineering nightmare. The Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major displaced 71 liters and weighed about 1,850 kilograms. For a single-engine carrier fighter, this was not merely an engine, but a true colossus, capable of changing the aircraft's balance, landing gear loads, and behavior in the air through its weight alone. Its 28 cylinders were arranged in 4 tightly packed radial rows. That layout promised roughly 3,000 horsepower during takeoff, but such power came at the price of brutal complexity. Hundreds of components had to operate inside an extremely confined space. Cooling the inner cylinders became a separate battle, and access for mechanics turned into a struggle against metal. This concerned an engine that looked like a weapon of absolute superiority on paper, but was still unprepared for calm, reliable mass production. The Wasp Major required further development, dependable lubrication, stable temperature control, and a vast program of testing. A small defect in such a complicated mechanism could trigger a chain reaction: falling oil pressure, overheating, loss of revolutions, and the forced termination of a flight. The engineers at Chance Vought understood exactly what such haste could cost. The company had already suffered through serious problems with an immature power plant during the development of the standard F4U Corsair. Delays, dangerous defects, and endless modifications had pushed full-scale production back by more than 2 years and had dealt a painful blow to the company's reputation. Now the same specialists were being asked to tie the future of another promising fighter to an engine that had not yet proven its reliability. This time the power plant was heavier, stronger, and more complicated than anything they had handled before. It was hardly surprising that the Marine Corps proposal failed to inspire enthusiasm inside the design offices. This was not fear of new technology, nor caution for its own sake. The engineers faced a precise list of threats: an overloaded nose, enormous propeller torque, cooling difficulties, increased fuel consumption, and an uncertain structural service life. Even a successful engine start would prove almost nothing, because the aircraft had to do far more than take off. It had to fight, land on a carrier deck, and survive daily operational use. Yet Chance Vought could not simply close the file and refuse. The United States Marine Corps was one of the Corsair's principal customers, and wartime allowed little room for prolonged disputes between military command and industry. The engineers wanted no part of this mechanical monster, but completely ignoring the customer's demand would have been even more dangerous. In August 1943, the argument finally left the offices and moved into the hangar. Chance Vought received several experimental Pratt and Whitney R-4360 Wasp major engines. The military no longer wanted calculations, cautious forecasts, or long technical tables. It wanted an aircraft that could actually leave the ground. The engineers chose the most direct and, at the same time, the most dangerous approach. Instead of designing a new airframe, they took a production F4U Corsair and began adapting it to the gigantic power plant. The engine mount, cowling, cooling system, oil lines, and controls all required urgent modification. Under normal conditions, such work could have taken months, but wartime allowed no room for a slow and comfortable development program. This concerns those rare moments when industry operates close to the limit of human endurance. Designers, mechanics, and test crews worked at the same time, without waiting for every calculation to be completed. A single mistake could destroy the engine, start a fire, or cost them the experimental aircraft. Yet only 3 weeks later, the modified Corsair was ready for its first flight. When the pilot lined up on the runway and opened the throttle, it became clear that the new engine had done more than add power. It seemed to fire the heavy aircraft forward. The takeoff run was short, the acceleration was violent, and the climb began with such force that observers could easily believe the Marine Corps had found the road to the ultimate piston-engine fighter. The prototype was especially convincing close to the ground. In the very conditions where the standard Corsair was already considered exceptionally fast, the Wasp major machine pulled ahead even more decisively. Low-altitude speed increased by roughly 100 kilometers per hour, while the climb became far more energetic. The enormous engine was doing exactly what it had been installed to do, turning power into a brutal and physically visible force. This concerns the kind of early result that could blind a customer. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, climbed aggressively, and left the standard model behind. During the first stage of testing, the project no longer looked like a questionable gamble. It looked like a brilliant engineering success. For a brief moment, it seemed that the risk had paid off and the mechanical giant had been brought under control. But a few successful minutes in the air did not mean victory. The longer the test team watched the aircraft, the clearer it became that the impressive speed was hiding the very problems the engineers had feared from the beginning. The enormous power had given the Corsair a new character, but it had also brought overheating, instability, and a dangerous workload for the pilot. That was where the good news ended. The first minutes of testing looked almost triumphant, but the brilliant picture began to collapse as soon as the aircraft started climbing. Close to the ground, the Wasp Major delivered a sharp advantage, yet that advantage faded with every additional kilometer of altitude. From roughly 7,000 meters, the experimental Corsair was barely different from a production aircraft powered by the standard engine producing about 2,400 horsepower. For a project built around the promise of overwhelming superiority, this was a serious blow. The enormous engine, the complex conversion, and the brutal load imposed on the airframe failed to produce the expected result, where a fighter would have to conduct high-altitude combat. In practice, the engineers had gained a powerful low-level burst at an extraordinary cost, not complete combat dominance. This concerns the central contradiction of the entire aircraft. 3,000 horsepower sounded like a verdict against any opponent, but real performance was not determined by a single power figure. The supercharger, cooling system, altitude performance, propeller, and aerodynamics had to operate as one mechanism. In this case, that mechanism began to fall apart precisely when maximum performance was demanded. The engine repeatedly exceeded its normal thermal limits. Temperatures climbed, revolutions fluctuated, and oil pressure became unstable. The Wasp Major lost oil in flight, while mechanics discovered fresh signs of overheating and leakage after landing. Only by some extraordinary stroke of luck did the test crews avoid a major accident. Yet even on the rare days when the engine behaved, the aircraft remained dangerous. The enormous propeller and tremendous torque pulled the machine to the left with such force that the pilot had to fight the controls continuously. When power was applied sharply, the Corsair tried to roll toward its left wing, especially at low speed and during takeoff. This was no longer a matter of discomfort. It was a direct threat. The pilot could not simply monitor altitude, speed, and heading. He had to work the pedals and control stick constantly, preventing the heavy fighter from entering a sudden roll. One mistake, one delayed reaction, or one incorrect movement could turn the engine's power into the very force that drove the aircraft toward the ground. The test pilots quickly understood that this machine did not forgive fatigue. It demanded not only experience but almost continuous physical effort. In combat, where a pilot also had to locate the enemy, fire his weapons, watch the instruments, and manage fuel, such a workload would become unacceptable. Chance Vought received exactly the confirmation it had feared from the beginning. The new engine had not transformed the Corsair into an absolute weapon. Instead, it had added an entire list of weaknesses: overheating, oil loss, unstable revolutions, dangerous torque, and exhausting handling. For a design bureau already burdened with wartime orders and the refinement of production aircraft, that was more than enough. Chance Vought reached its conclusion quickly and without illusions. Continuing the painful development effort alone would be too expensive. The design bureau was already overloaded with production orders, corrections to the standard Corsair, and urgent demands from the front. The future of the machine was therefore handed to a subcontractor whose name, at first glance, seemed completely out of place beside a brutal carrier fighter. That subcontractor was Goodyear. To most people, the name meant automobile tires, rubber, and enormous factories in Ohio. Yet behind the image of a tire giant stood a far more complex industrial organization, one that had worked with aviation for years and knew how to build much more than wheels for cars. This concerns Goodyear's pre-war specialization. The company produced airships, envelopes, aviation materials, and large structures for lighter-than-air craft. Its engineers understood aerodynamics, load-bearing elements, and the mass production of complicated machinery. When the Second World War began, that experience suddenly became a strategic resource. Demand for civilian airships collapsed, while the Army and Navy demanded thousands of new aircraft. Goodyear rapidly converted its facilities and entered the military production program. At its plants in Akron, licensed production of the Corsair began under the factory designation FG. During the war, the company built more than 4,000 of these aircraft. This was no random contractor assembling a few parts from someone else's drawings. Goodyear had mastered the entire production cycle, knew the weak points of the design, and understood how much labor was hidden inside every bend of the famous inverted gull wing. This concerns the central reason why the project was transferred. Chance Vought was not handing the aircraft to amateur tire makers, but to an industrial team that had already produced Corsairs by the thousand. Goodyear possessed factories, specialists, testing facilities, and direct practical experience with this exact airframe. But the new assignment was far more difficult than anything it had done before. It was one thing to manufacture a proven production fighter from completed documentation. It was something else entirely to take an aircraft burdened with a monstrous engine, dangerous torque, and a mountain of unresolved defects, then turn it into a usable combat machine. Goodyear could no longer simply repeat Chance Vaught's solutions. The tail, controls, cooling system, cockpit visibility, and behavior during takeoff and landing all had to be reconsidered. And this is where the story took a sharp turn. A company the world associated with tires and airships was now expected to lead the creation of one of the most powerful piston-engine fighters of its era. Who would dare take responsibility for such a mechanical beast after the failures of the first tests? For Goodyear, this was not an ordinary production contract. It was a brutal examination of engineering maturity, a genuine challenge from which there was no easy retreat. Goodyear needed almost 2 years to turn a dangerous experiment into an aircraft that could at least be discussed seriously as a future fighter. During that time, one fact became impossible to ignore. The project was no longer a simple engine replacement. The enormous Wasp Major altered the aircraft's balance, increased loads on the tail, and demanded such extensive redesign that the original Corsair began to disappear inside the new machine. When the first pre-production F2G rolled onto the runway at Akron, it still carried the familiar outline. The inverted gull wing remained because it provided the necessary clearance for the huge propeller and helped the aircraft behave more confidently at low speed. Yet beneath that recognizable shape stood a different fighter, heavier, sharper, and far less forgiving. This concerned the tail assembly above all. The standard vertical stabilizer could not provide enough control against the brutal torque of the new engine. Engineers increased both its area and height, trying to give the pilot greater authority in yaw. Even that, however, was not enough. Then came one of the most unusual features of the entire design. The rudder was divided into 2 vertical sections, an upper and a lower one. When the flaps were lowered into the landing position, the lower section automatically deflected 12.5 degrees to the right. This was not a decorative trick or an engineering curiosity. It was a hard operational necessity. During takeoff and landing, the enormous propeller converted engine power into a dangerous pull to the left. At low speed, the control surfaces were less effective, and the pilot could not fight the aircraft endlessly with pedal pressure alone. The automatic rudder deflection was intended to create a counteracting force before the pilot lost control. This concerns the central logic of the redesign. Every new component appeared as a response to a specific threat. The enlarged tail fought poor directional stability. The split rudder helped during the most dangerous phases of flight. Even the Corsair's famous wing now served a machine whose power had moved far beyond the limits of the original design. The cockpit also had to change. The older canopy restricted visibility, and on an aircraft with a heavy nose and difficult handling, that became a serious weakness. The pilot needed a better view of the runway, the carrier deck, and the space around the aircraft, especially during the landing approach. The F2G therefore received a teardrop canopy that greatly improved visibility to the sides and rear. Step by step, the project lost all resemblance to an ordinary modernization. The engineers were no longer dealing with a production F4U fitted with a new engine, but with a deeply revised fighter whose power plant had forced changes to nearly everything around it. The more components they redesigned, the clearer the truth became. The Wasp Major did not fit into the Corsair. It reshaped the entire aircraft around its own strength. The teardrop canopy for the new aircraft was not designed from scratch. Engineers used a proven solution already fitted to later versions of the P-47 Thunderbolt. This saved time, simplified production, and gave the pilot a much better view to the sides and rear. Yet even this noticeable feature was only an external detail beside what was hidden beneath the cowling. The true heart of the F2G was the Pratt and Whitney R4360 Wasp Major. By the time the aircraft underwent its deep redesign, this 28-cylinder giant was already very different from the immature engine used during the first tests. Its designers had managed to raise the service life to roughly 600 hours, turning an experimental power plant into an engine suitable at least for limited operational use. This concerns the most difficult part of the entire project, not simply making the engine produce enormous power, but ensuring that it could survive for more than a few dangerous flights. For a 4-row radial with a displacement of 71 liters, a service life of 600 hours was a serious achievement. Yet the engineers did not stop at reliability and began extracting everything that metal, fuel, and cooling systems could provide. A 2-speed supercharger supplied the cylinders with the required airflow, while water injection allowed boost pressure to rise for short periods without immediate detonation. Under maximum emergency power, output reached approximately 3,600 horsepower. For a single-engine fighter of the mid-1940s, that figure was almost monstrous. But such force still had to be converted into thrust. An ordinary propeller could not use the engine's full potential, so the F2G received a massive propeller measuring about 4 meters and 20 centimeters in diameter. Its blades seized an enormous volume of air, and every sudden throttle movement sent a violent load through the engine mount, the tail, and the pilot's hands. This concerns the point where technical admiration stood beside direct danger. The huge propeller gave the aircraft savage acceleration and impressive climb performance, but it also increased the torque that had already forced engineers to redesign the fin and rudder. On the F2G, nearly every gain in power demanded another structural response. The armament matched the scale of the machine. Depending on the configuration, the fighter was intended to carry 4 or 6 Colt Browning heavy machine guns of 50 caliber. That was enough to unleash a crushing burst against an aerial target and reduce it to a mass of damaged metal within seconds. Yet the F2G was not intended only for air combat. Mounting points beneath the wings and fuselage could carry rockets, bombs, and external fuel tanks, while the total rocket and bomb load could reach 2 metric tons. The engineers were no longer creating merely a fast interceptor, but a heavy multi-role strike aircraft capable of carrying an almost bomber-sized payload. This was the technical portrait of an aircraft pushed close to the limits of the piston-engine era. 3,600 horsepower, a propeller more than 4 meters across, as many as 6 heavy machine guns, and 2 tons of external ordnance sounded like the description of an absolute weapon. But the closer the F2G came to that limit, the more merciless the central question became. Could a carrier fighter not only lift such power into the sky, but endure it every day. On August 26, 1944, the moment arrived at Goodyear's airfield in Akron, for which engineers had spent months rebuilding the familiar Corsair. At the controls sat the company's chief test pilot, Don Armstrong. Before him stood an aircraft that attempted to combine the power of a heavy bomber engine with the dimensions of a single-seat fighter. Armstrong guided the experimental machine onto the runway and advanced the throttle. The enormous propeller seized the air, the heavy aircraft surged forward, and after a short takeoff run, it broke sharply from the ground. When the engine reached full power, the acceleration pressed the pilot hard into his seat. The Super Corsair did not seem to climb. It appeared to claw its way upward on raw, violent thrust. This concerns one of those rare moments when numbers from engineering tables suddenly became visible to everyone nearby. The test team on the ground heard the roar of 28 cylinders and watched the massive fighter rise at an astonishing rate. In only a few minutes, the aircraft reached an altitude that required noticeably more time for a standard Corsair. On that day, the project no longer looked like a dangerous conversion. It looked almost like a finished weapon. Yet the government order had appeared before this spectacular flight. In March 1944, the United States Navy had already approved a major production program for the F2G. Approximately 418 aircraft were ordered, an enormous commitment to a machine that still existed mainly in calculations and converted prototypes. Such a contract represented more than confidence. It meant preparing production lines, securing engines, training workers, and assigning military units that expected to receive the new fighter. Goodyear now had to turn an impressive experimental aircraft into a production machine capable of flying combat missions every day without constant attention from factory specialists. This concerns the most dangerous gap between a prototype and a series production aircraft. One brilliant flight could prove that the design was capable of leaving the ground. Hundreds of machines required consistent quality, dependable engines, spare parts, and maintenance procedures that ordinary ground crews could understand. At that point, time began working against the Super Corsair. While engineers fought overheating, difficult handling, and delays in Wasp major deliveries, the war moved rapidly toward its conclusion. In August 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The aircraft created for the extreme demands of a global conflict suddenly had no urgent combat mission and no political justification for enormous further expenditure. Only a handful of aircraft remained from the original ambition. Goodyear completed just 10 production F2Gs, while another 7 test aircraft were converted from standard FG1s. Instead of hundreds of fighters, the Navy received a tiny group of rare machines, each one a reminder of the failed attempt to push piston-engine power to its absolute limit. The loudest triumph of the program therefore became the beginning of its end. The Super Corsair proved that it could shock observers with thrust, climb, and brutal force. But its decisive opponent was not a Japanese fighter and not anti-aircraft fire. It was the end of the war, the event that caused the remaining order to be canceled. The most powerful single-engine piston fighter of its era proved powerless against a new reality. Yesterday, 3,000 horsepower had seemed like a passport to the future. Now the first jet aircraft were already undergoing trials on American airfields. Piston aviation had not vanished, but its remaining time was shrinking rapidly, and the Navy no longer wanted to pay for records that offered no decisive advantage in daily combat service. The American Naval Command faced a simple and merciless choice. It did not need the loudest engine or the most violent acceleration at low altitude. It needed a compact carrier fighter that could leave the deck quickly, climb hard, return safely to an aircraft carrier, and fly again without days of mechanical struggle. Against those demands, the F2G began to look less like the peak of progress and more like an expensive excess of machinery. This concerned operations above all. The 4-row Wasp Major required difficult maintenance, constant attention to temperature and oil pressure, and inspection of numerous components buried deep inside the engine. Where a conventional power plant could be checked and prepared by an ordinary carrier crew, the Super Corsair threatened to turn every sortie into a separate engineering campaign. Its handling remained severe as well. The huge propeller and crushing torque did not disappear after engineers installed the enlarged fin and auxiliary rudder. They managed to soften the aircraft's behavior, but they could not make it calm. A mistake during a sudden application of power, especially at low speed, could still place the pilot in immediate danger. Beside this machine stood the Grumman F8F Bearcat. It did not attempt to impress anyone with monstrous power, and it did not carry the burden of a radical conversion of an older airframe. The Bearcat was designed as a compact carrier fighter with exceptional climb performance and maneuverability, intended for hard daily operation from aircraft carriers. This concerned two completely different engineering philosophies. The F2G offered brute force, an enormous engine, a heavy structure, and exceptional performance under selected conditions. The Bearcat offered balance, lower weight, the familiar R2800 engine family, more understandable maintenance, and performance the Navy could use without constantly fighting the aircraft. On paper, the Super Corsair had not been destroyed by its rival. It was fast, accelerated savagely, and possessed a tremendous reserve of power. But a carrier aircraft is not judged by maximum speed alone. How long does it occupy space in the hangar? How quickly can mechanics return it to service? Can a young pilot land it safely on a moving deck after an exhausting mission? Those questions, more than any spectacular figure, appear to have decided the project's fate. The Navy placed its confidence in the more practical Bearcat, while the handful of F2Gs were pushed to the margins of military aviation. The aircraft, once intended for production by the hundreds, received no combat squadrons, no permanent place on carrier decks, and no opportunity to prove itself against a real enemy. This concerns the particularly ruthless nature of wartime industry. While the government needs a project, its cost is measured in tens of thousands of dollars, and factories, contracts, and hundreds of specialists stand behind it. Once the requirement disappears, yesterday's weapon of the future instantly becomes unwanted property that officials want removed from storage as quickly as possible. The factory cost of a single F2G was estimated at roughly $75,000. After the program ended, individual aircraft were sold to private owners for only $1,500 to $2,000. One of America's most powerful piston fighters lost nearly all of its monetary value and vanished from military aviation, as though the Navy wanted to forget the overly complicated aircraft that had arrived at the end of the war too late. The military career of the Super Corsair was over, but the aircraft unexpectedly received a second chance. The very qualities that had made it an impractical carrier fighter were almost perfect for air racing. A racing aircraft did not need long range, heavy armament, carrier landings, or hours of patrol endurance. It needed acceleration, speed close to the ground, and an engine capable of surviving several minutes at the absolute limit. Under those conditions, the Pratt and Whitney Wasp Major could finally reveal its true strength. Its weak high-altitude performance no longer mattered because racing aircraft flew their courses at low level, circling pylons only a short distance above the ground. 3,000 horsepower, an enormous propeller, and savage acceleration transformed a failed military project into a dangerous sporting contender. This concerned the brutal world of the post-war national air races at Cleveland. Former combat aircraft lost their guns, armor, radios, and everything else that did not increase speed. Airframes were lightened and polished, induction systems were modified, and wings were sometimes shortened. Yesterday's fighters returned to battle, but their enemies were now the stopwatch and rival pilots flying only a few dozen meters above the ground. One of the men who recognized his opportunity in this new kind of war was United States Navy aviator Cook Cleland. He had gained extensive experience flying combat aircraft during the war, and civilian life did not destroy his appetite for speed. The revival of the Thompson Trophy race gave him a way to turn wartime skill into a personal campaign for first place. Cleland first placed his hopes in a standard Goodyear F2G Corsair. The guns, armor protection, and heavy radio equipment were removed, and the aircraft was carefully prepared for the racing circuit. Named Lucky Gallon, the modified fighter entered the Thompson Trophy race in 1946. This concerned the first painful test of Cleland's ambition. The ordinary Corsair completed the race at an average speed of roughly 357 miles per hour, an impressive result by any normal measure. Yet it was enough for only 6th place. The victorious Army P-39 era Cobra was approximately 17 miles per hour faster. For the former naval pilot, defeat by an Army aircraft became a personal challenge. He now knew that the standard Corsair had great potential, but its 2,000 horsepower engine was not enough to fight for outright victory. He needed an aircraft that produced its greatest advantage exactly where the race was flown, almost at ground level. Cleland then learned that the Navy intended to sell several of the extremely rare F2Gs. To the military, they were expensive, demanding aircraft that had arrived too late for war. To a racer, they looked like treasure, a powerful Wasp Major, an enormous reserve of thrust, and an airframe that could be lightened, stripped of military equipment, and rebuilt for one purpose alone: speed. This concerned the moment when the failure of a military program became the beginning of a sporting legend. Cleland managed to acquire several Super Corsairs and began preparing them for competition. Their wings were shortened, drag was reduced, and unnecessary equipment disappeared until little remained beyond the pilot, fuel, engine, and brute force. A machine unlike any forgotten carrier fighter now stood on the airfield. The dark blue F2G sat low over the runway, its huge propeller and polished airframe reflecting the light. After the disappointment of the previous year, Cook Cleland was not returning merely to take part. This time he had an aircraft built for revenge. In 1947, the dark blue F2G, carrying race number 74, entered the Thompson Trophy course. The route consisted of 20 laps, each 15 miles long, with aircraft circling the pylons almost at ground level. There was no room for caution. One incorrect maneuver, an overheated cylinder, or a delayed reaction could throw a competitor out of the race in seconds. Cook Cleland immediately forced the Super Corsair to operate in a way military test crews had never demanded. The enormous Wasp Major roared at extreme power, the clipped wings cut through the air, and the heavy machine completed lap after lap at a speed that had recently seemed impossible for a piston aircraft. The winner's average was about 396 miles per hour, nearly 637 kilometers per hour. This was not a single fortunate burst along a straight section. The Super Corsair had to maintain that pace through the entire distance, surviving violent turns around the pylons and continuous engine operation near its limits. Cleland finished first, while Dick Becker took second place in another F2G. The aircraft, rejected by the Navy as too difficult for service, crushed its rivals because of the very power that had made it impractical. Victory delivered the revenge Cleland wanted after the previous year, but it also created a dangerous temptation to extract even more from the aircraft. For the 1948 season, the remaining racing F2Gs received heavily modified induction systems with long carburetor air scoops. The team also prepared experimental fuel rated at roughly 200 octane, known as methyltryptane. The qualifying results looked terrifying. Cleland reached approximately 417 miles per hour, while Becker recorded about 406. They were only slightly behind the leading Army Cobra. The gap amounted to only a handful of miles per hour, and it seemed that the dark blue monsters would once again overwhelm the field during the race itself. This concerned the old weakness at the heart of the entire F2G program. Every attempt to obtain a few more horsepower destroyed part of the safety margin. The new fuel proved too violent for an induction system that had not been tested thoroughly enough. Within the first few laps, explosions and backfires tore through the intake passages, and the long scoops were ripped loose by the airflow. Becker was forced out first, and Cleland soon followed. Only minutes earlier, the two Super Corsairs had been regarded as the main favorites. Now both were returning to the ground with damaged induction systems. Power had once again revealed its savage nature. It offered record speed, but demanded a merciless price. For the 1949 season, the team prepared more carefully. Vertical end plates appeared on the clipped wings, the fuel and induction systems were refined, and a third F2G joined the group. During qualifying, Dick Becker achieved roughly 415 miles per hour, Cleland about 407, and Ben McKillen approximately 396. But the machinery delivered another blow before the main event began. The propeller reduction gears in Becker's aircraft were damaged, eliminating the fastest F2G of the weekend. It appeared that the same story was beginning again, yet this time the remaining Super Corsairs endured the strain. This was the final triumph of the racing program. Cleland completed the course at an average of approximately 397 miles per hour and won the Thompson Trophy for the second time. Ron Puckett finished behind him, while Ben McKillen took third. 3 F2Gs occupied the entire podium, a clean sweep no aircraft type had previously achieved in that race. Cleland's winning speed remained the class record until the late 1960s. Across 3 racing seasons, the Super Corsairs earned 2 victories, 2 second places, and 1 third, proving that the Wasp Major's low-altitude power seemed almost purpose-built for pylon racing. Where the Navy had seen a heavy and temperamental fighter, racers saw a machine capable of turning every lap into a demonstration of raw force. Cook Cleland lived a long life, and his name remained permanently linked to 2 Thompson Trophy victories. The blue aircraft carrying number 74 spent decades in a private collection after its racing career before undergoing a difficult restoration. In 2011, it received an airworthiness certificate again and became one of only 2 F2Gs then capable of returning to the sky. On September 7, 2012, the blue Super Corsair, carrying race number 74, rose once more above Barnes County Municipal Airport in North Dakota. At the controls was experienced pilot and restorer Bob Odegaard, preparing a routine for the Wings and Wheels air show. The aircraft that had survived war, abandonment, and decades of storage was expected to demonstrate the brutal power of the Wasp Major one more time. The first elements of the practice flight showed no obvious irregularities. The aircraft then entered a maneuver resembling the beginning of a barrel roll, climbed to roughly 300 meters, and became inverted. There was no longer enough altitude to recover the flight path. The F2G struck the ground at high speed, was completely destroyed, and the pilot did not survive. This concerns one of the most bitter details in the entire story. Witnesses heard no unusual engine sounds and saw no components separating from the aircraft before impact. Propeller marks indicated that the power plant was still producing power, but the wreckage was so extensive that investigators could not complete a full continuity check of the flight controls. No simple and convenient explanation for the accident ever emerged. The loss involved far more than a rare museum aircraft. One of the few F2Gs still capable of flight had disappeared, taking with it the living sound of 28 cylinders. Yet the event also forces us back to the question that followed the project from the beginning. Why did the United States Navy need such a complicated machine at all? What exactly was the Super Corsair supposed to replace? The standard F4U was already being produced in enormous numbers, operating successfully from land bases and gradually mastering carrier decks. The new aircraft was too expensive and temperamental to serve as a straightforward replacement, yet it lacked a decisive advantage across all altitudes that could justify calling it a revolutionary fighter. This concerns the central weakness of the concept itself. Close to the ground, the F2G accelerated savagely and climbed with almost theatrical ease. But by roughly 7 kilometers, much of its advantage over the ordinary Corsair had disappeared. The result was a frightening low-altitude sprinter carrying an enormous engine, a demanding cooling system, and heavy maintenance requirements for an edge available only within a narrow range of conditions. That was not enough for a combat aircraft. A fighter had to do more than produce an exceptional speed under favorable circumstances. It had to escort bombers, intercept targets at different altitudes, remain airborne for long periods, and return to service after routine maintenance. The F2G demanded too much from mechanics and pilots without offering an equally universal answer to the needs of the front. Its position in the skies of Western Europe looked especially doubtful. Air combat and the escort of heavy bombers often took place at high altitude, precisely where the main advantage of the Wasp Major began to fade. Sending such a complex and heavy fighter into that environment, without a consistent advantage over simpler aircraft, meant paying an enormous price for an impressive horsepower figure. This does not mean that the project was useless or doomed from its first drawing. It served as an important experimental platform, helped advance the Wasp Major, and demonstrated how close American piston-engine aviation had come to its practical limits. But as a production combat weapon, the F2G was trapped between the end of the war, changing naval requirements, and the advance of the jet age. United States Navy aviation histories confirm that the program was closed in the post-war period. The verdict was therefore severe but understandable. Engineers created one of the most impressive piston fighters of its time, yet they never gave it a clear place inside the weapon system. The Super Corsair could astonish with power, win races, and force people to look toward the sky. But in the air war over Western Europe, it never received a convincing mission. After the program was closed, a convenient and dramatic legend grew around the F2G. According to this version, the Americans supposedly predicted that Japan would turn to attacks by piloted flying bombs and created the Super Corsair specifically as a fast, low-altitude interceptor. The story sounds convincing. Enormous power, savage acceleration near the ground, and an aircraft able to catch the attacker before it reached the fleet. But the chronology destroys that picture. Work on fitting the Wasp Major to the Corsair began before such a threat could have become the main reason for the program. The idea was born from the desire to obtain a more powerful carrier fighter, not from a completed plan to counter Japanese flying projectiles. Later events merely made it possible to attach an attractive explanation to the F2G after the fact. This concerns a common habit of turning every unsuccessful military project into a supposedly classified answer to a special threat. When an aircraft possesses unusual characteristics, stories quickly appear about a secret mission, a hidden order, and an enemy known at the time only to a select few. Yet documents and dates usually tell a more ordinary story. Engineers were experimenting with power, while the war changed faster than industry could bring the idea into production. Does that mean the Super Corsair was a useless mistake? No. Such a verdict would be too easy and unfair. The project did not provide the Navy with a mass-produced fighter, but it forced industry to solve problems that only a short time earlier had appeared almost impossible. Engineers learned how to operate the 28-cylinder Wasp Major inside the confined engine compartment of a single-engine aircraft. They fought overheating, lubrication failures, torque, vibration, and enormous loads on the propeller. Every test flight produced information later used in the development of one of the most complicated American piston engines of its era. This concerns the true legacy of the F2G. It became less a combat fighter than a flying test stand on which the limits of the engine, propeller, and airframe were explored. Failure in one role became a contribution in another. The aircraft never entered operational squadrons, but it helped industry understand how to manage power already moving beyond the familiar boundaries of piston aviation. And that is the central paradox of the entire story. The F2G arrived too late for the war, lost to the more practical Bearcat, and proved too demanding for routine carrier service. Yet the same excess made it unique. It showed how far engineers could go while extracting the final reserves from the piston engine before the arrival of the jet age. It was a truly beautiful aircraft, heavy, dangerous, temperamental, and extraordinarily expressive. Its enormous propeller, teardrop canopy, and famous inverted gull wing created a silhouette impossible to confuse with any other machine. It lacked the calm rationality of a mature production weapon. It looked like the final desperate charge of an entire technological era. This is not an attempt to excuse every failure of the project. The F2G truly lacked a clear combat role and demanded too much effort for an advantage available only under limited conditions. But aviation history is not made only by winners produced in their thousands. Sometimes a rare aircraft that never fulfilled its intended role reveals the limits of its time more clearly than any successful design. The Super Corsair did not become master of the sky and did not change the course of the war, but it left behind knowledge, records, racing victories, and an engine refined through punishing trials. It should therefore be remembered not as a useless failure, but as a daring engineering experiment that arrived too late for war and remained one of the brightest symbols of the twilight of piston aviation. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Support the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss new stories about forgotten aircraft, secret projects, and the people who raised these machines into the sky. Peace and good health to you and your loved ones. Until next time.